Hello and welcome to another episode of your AKT Podcast, which is hosted by WellMedic.co.uk. Now, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on the way that we work, and it's important to consider how this may be tested within the AKT, whether that's from a kind of vaccination, immunization perspective, or whether it's around remote consulting. Now, remote consulting has become the norm, so it's important to consider the impact of remote consulting on our practice. So in this scenario, we're going to focus on NG136, which is the NICE guidance for hypertension. So a patient has booked a telephone consultation with yourself due to his ongoing symptoms of having a fuzzy head. He's taken his own blood pressure at home and he has a systolic of 170 with a diastolic of 85. Now, the patient's mother suffers with hypertension and he would like to start medication today. How would he best manage this scenario, and how would he explain this option to the patient? So in a scenario like this, we often want confirmation of what the blood pressure readings are doing so that we can get a true representative reading of the patient's blood pressure. So typically, we would resort to ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, which would be an average from at least 14 blood pressure readings taken between 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. or whatever is considered the patient's normal waking hours. Now, ambulatory blood pressure monitoring may not be available, so the next best option would be to do home blood pressure monitoring. So explaining home blood pressure monitoring is something that I've become very familiar with over this COVID-19 pandemic. So, blood pressure readings should be taken twice daily, in the morning and in the evening, and for each reading, 2 consecutive measurements should be taken 1 minute apart from each other, and the patient should remain seated during this process. Measurements should be recorded for a minimum of 4 days, but ideally we'd want at least 7 days worth of measurements. And when calculating the average, measurements from day 1 should be discarded, and then you calculate the average using the remaining measurements. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. This podcast is hosted by wellmedic.co.uk. We help GP trainees pass the AKT.